Next, let's talk about human settlement in Africa. And Africa has the longest history of human settlement because it is the home of humankind. So over millions of years, people have evolved in Africa, and then from Africa, spread through the Middle East and to the other parts of the world. But Africa is where people have lived the longest. And in, kind of jumping well ahead here, Africa developed trade patterns based on what's called regional complementarity. And complementarity, if you recall, means when different places have different kinds of goods that each other need. And where you see this in Africa most strikingly is between the forested areas and the deserts. And because they have, wood products, other resources in the forested areas, a lot of more natural resources than deserts. But deserts do have one thing important: they have salt. Now, why is salt important? Because before refrigeration, especially in tropical environments, it was hard to preserve food, but salt is a preservative that will allow you to preserve your food. Kind of like that. It's early human refrigerators, basically. And along that zone, where you kind of have the in-between areas between the Sahara Desert and the tropical environments in West Africa, this is another cultural hearth. It's called the West African cultural hearth. And so let's take a closer look at that. So, and we have regional complementarity between the Sahara and the more tropical zones. You have cultural hearth here of overlapping empires and kingdoms that have come in West Africa, such as Ghana and some others. And another important aspect of the West African cultural hearth is you had diffusion from there to other parts of Africa. There's a long period called the Bantu migration about 5,000 years ago, which brought both languages and agriculture to other parts of Africa as well. Now, Africa did have its own history and evolved independently from other parts of the world, but with the expansion of European powers, you had a heavier involvement of Europeans in African affairs, which is really an understatement. And it really starts with the Portuguese. We talked about this figure before of the Treaty of Tordesillas that divided zones of the earth between the exploring Spanish and Portuguese. And so while the Spanish were heavily involved on this side of the line, including much of Latin America, if you recall, we talked about how the Treaty of Tordesillas lopped off a little bit of Brazil here, which is why the Portuguese were the main colonizers of Brazil. But what is also on the other side here in the Portuguese jurisdiction is Africa. So Spain and Portugal had different approaches to finding shipping routes to East Asia, where Spain, the idea was with Christopher Columbus, was just kind of head this way until you hit East Asia, not realizing there was all these other continents in the way, which is, a whole other history. However, the Portuguese's approach was, rather than doing that, is to make their way around Africa. So the Portuguese were amongst the first European powers to establish ports and otherwise interact with Africa in like the 1400s, 1500s. In fact, they were heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade. We talked about how this is a figure showing the volume of people brought in slavery in the transatlantic slave trade to various parts of the Americas. So in U.S. history, we talk about slavery, but if you look at the numbers, and it's quite a substantial number in North America, but then if you look at how many people were brought to places like Brazil, for example, it's huge. And one explanatory factor is that Brazil is a Portuguese colony, and Brazil is also involved in Africa in the transatlantic slave trade. Before we kind of delve deeper into that, I want to introduce a concept called the triangular trade. And so the idea is that there's a trading pattern made up of sort of a triangle, where from Europe to Africa, you know, ships would come with manufactured goods, such as guns, alcohol, manufactured goods. And then from Africa, this is where the transatlantic slave trade would pick up. So while there were European colonies in the Americas, most of these had plantations. And if you recall, plantations are these intensely cultivated areas. And originally they were highly dependent on slave labor to exploiting of slave labor to produce the goods there. So from there, people would be brought in bondage, in slavery, to the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America. And then the goods that were produced on these plantations and mines and other things, gold, silver, tobacco, sugar, rum, which is a product from sugar, would then be brought back to Europe. So this makes a triangle. And one reason for the shape of that is a little bit of physical geography. That we've talked about the North Atlantic drift, but there is kind of a loop of a current, of a kind of a circular current that runs from Europe southward to Africa, and then from Africa westward to the Americas, and then circles back and goes up towards Europe. And that's one reason that you have this circular pattern, because remember, these are sailing ships. They're using the currents and the winds to make their way to these different places. Right, so colonialism starts with Portugal. They explore along the coast. They start to control trade. However, other European, as word gets out about the amount of resources in Africa, and this is during the time of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of these European countries are becoming much more powerful and have a lot more guns, sailing ships, other resources. And there's a strong need for raw materials to kind of fuel this Industrial Revolution. And so they were really quick to try to take over much of Africa. And this period is called the Scramble for Africa. And really at the height of it is a thing called the Conference of Berlin in the late 1800s. These European powers had a big meeting where they got maps of Africa and essentially just started to arbitrarily cut it up amongst these powers, creating borders and dividing it up as to which country, and negotiating which country would come in and take over which parts of Africa. So I think I want you to ask yourself, what is a problem with colonial powers in another continent with little knowledge of the people that live in a place coming up with these kind of new borders? You can imagine that it's maybe not going to do well. If you look at, and so this is one problem that still remains in Africa, is that the modern country borders in Africa are really a result of this Berlin Conference. You have different ethno-linguistic areas in red here, high amount of cultural diversity amongst different peoples in Africa. Like each one of these circles is kind of a different ethnic or linguistic group. And then on top of that, you have the overlay of these arbitrary country boundaries. And these country boundaries, because they don't really follow where the people live, they do two things. One is they group people together that may not want to be in the same country. And two is they cut people off. There are people of some ethnic groups where part of them live in one country and part of them live on the other. So this is kind of similar to the stateless nation problem of the Kurds that we talked about, but this is really widespread across Africa, where you have the borders of these countries were arbitrarily imposed on the people of Africa. And this can be problematic, of course. This is showing some of the colonial powers in sub-Saharan Africa. In West Africa, you had primarily the French and the British. This is the Belgian Congo with King Leopold. I'm going to include a video that talks about that. I'd like you to really pay attention to that. You had the Portuguese colonies, including Angola, Mozambique, You had, and the only real independent one that remained independent during this period was Ethiopia. Ethiopia was, the Italians tried to colonize Ethiopia, but they really weren't successful in keeping it. So this is a figure showing the evolution. So prior to the Conference of Berlin, you have a situation that's a bit more fluid like this. You have these different kingdoms, and you have some incursions by European powers, but not the borders that we have today. And you also had the independent kingdom of Ethiopia. After the Conference of Berlin, the only independent one left is Ethiopia, and you have these big imposed borders that have been imposed over Africa. Now, starting in the kind of the late 1950s, going into the 1960s, you have independence movement in places like Africa, where other former colonies start to gain their independence. Until about in the 1990s, you have pretty much all of Africa is now no longer a colony of a European power. So you go from, kind of a fluid situation to complete control, nearly complete control by European powers, until in the late 1900s, regaining of independence. However, the independent countries are now saddled with those borders that were created by the Conference of Berlin. So it's good news, bad news situation. Here's another figure that kind of shows before and after the Conference of Berlin, 1800s. You had these different kingdoms. This is called the Cape Colony by the British. Some incursions by, France and other countries. And then post-Conference of Berlin, you had pretty much the complete carving out of all of Africa between different European powers, with the exception of Ethiopia. And so during this scramble for Africa, and after that, you had much of Africa was controlled by European powers. And one thing about that, though, is that there is diversity in how they maintain that control. Different governments had different approaches. For example, the British used what's called indirect rule, that what they would do is that they would negotiate with local leaders, and they would empower them, who are loyal to the British, to kind of rule indirectly. Whereas Portugal, on the other hand, sent their own people and had harsh and direct control from Portugal. Now, France had a different approach altogether. What they try to do is find and cultivate people in their colony and bring them to France, educate them, kind of indoctrinate them as in French thinking and culture, kind of establish them in places of power in the country. And then you had some very really bad examples, namely in Belgium, King Leopold II really ruled by exploitation and genocide. We'll watch a video about him. And with some of the German colonies, you had conflicts where when people rebelled, they were killed in what were early genocides prior to World War II. So while we know a lot about, we should know, I think I've read where people don't know as much about the genocides of World War II as they used to, but you should know about the genocides in World War II. But there were other genocides that happened prior to that in Africa that were less well known because the word had not really gotten out. Now, in the case of Belgium, this is one case where word did start to get out. That this is the early days of like human rights campaigns, where religious people would find evidence of the harsh treatment. So, for example, there were people that if they didn't go work for the Belgians, that they would have their arms cut off. It's really horrible, awful things would happen. And so word of that did start to go out and really started to change things there. But you have, a wide variety of different ways of control of these different places.